Hello YouTube, I'm Joey Russo, disabled competitive pistol shooter, and today I'm coming out of retirement as Rangemaster to explain why I no longer use the SIG P320. Now before we begin, let me add this disclaimer. These are obviously only my professional opinions based on over 30 years serving in professions of arms. So you will better understand my perspective, I'll post down below my training and experience. The catalyst for this video were recent local news stories covering how the organization running our state's police academy, the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, is banning the SIG P320 to include the M17 and M18 after reports of shootings in which officers did not pull the trigger. For reference, I'll post links to all the stories below so you can check it out. Now, in the spirit of transparency, let me stop right here and tell you, for about 6 years I was contracted by the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, or as we locally refer to it, simply the CJTC, through my business, Triad Firearms Training, to teach firearms at both the basic academy and advanced instructor levels. But again, as I said earlier, these are only my opinions and mine alone, and do not represent those of the CJTC or any other entity for that matter. Anyway, after the news stories ran on television, folks began contacting me seeking my opinion. Most knew I was one of the earlier users of the P320, purchasing two when they first became available in 2014. In the years since buying those first two, I have purchased 3 more, multiple grip modules and slide assemblies. I really like the modularity of the design, allowing for easily reconfiguring the pistol. It's like Legos for adults. I also attended the P320 armor course a couple times and becoming intimately familiar with the design. Fast forward to now though, and I'm no longer a fan. In fact, I've mothballed all my P320s, no longer using them in any capacity. And here's why. Before we go to the bench, let me first show you an animation of the P320's sear and striker pin in operation. Alright, so first I need to point out the P320 is what we term a single action only, or SAO style of pistol. And what that means is that the striker pin here called out in orange, if you look in the ghost image behind it, you'll see the striker spring. A single action pistol has that striker spring fully energized. It has enough stored energy as the striker pin is sitting on the sear here in blue. That spring is fully energized with enough potential energy that when the striker pin leaves the sear, it's going to come forward and impact the primer in the cartridge and of course cause the round to go off. Now let me go ahead and start the animation. As the animation plays, note the relationship between the sear, which is here in blue, and that striker pin again in orange. Notice how the back of the sear is sitting on 2 small springs. There's actually 2 springs there, kind of the side of you looks like just one. And then notice how the front of the sear pivots on this pin in this area here. Notice as the triggers move rearward and the trigger bar moves actually forward, that trigger bar hits the sear in this area, and it's going to go ahead and cause the sear to then pivot downward, compressing those 2 small springs until such a point as this, we'll learn about the engagement surface of the sear, this area here, pivots far enough down to then allow the striker pin's lug or hook to slip off, boom, just like that. And again, the striker pin will move forward, impact the primer, and detonate the cartridge. All right, here we are at the bench looking from the top down onto the P320. The slide has obviously been removed, but I have the takedown lever in the locked position as if the P320 is fully assembled. The front is pointed this way, the barrel would be living in here. Here is the sear at the back, right here, this whole component here. If we look closely at the sear, we can see this engagement surface, this ledge, if you will, that interfaces with the lug off the striker pin. So if I get here, let's see if I can get a nice look at this. Here's our striker pin assembly, and here's the lug or hook off the striker pin, this surface here, that would engage or interface with this sear's engagement surface, this little ledge. When in the slide assembly, the striker pin assembly would be sitting kind of like this, and actually, since this is a single action auto pistol, that striker spring would be energized something like this. Now, like we saw in the animation, when I press the trigger to the rear, the trigger bar moves forward, carrying the rear of the sear downwards where that engagement surface is. So here we go. As I work the trigger, we can see the back of the sear where that engagement surface is. This ledge pivots or cams downward. I'll also, as a sidebar, note that this component piece here, this is the safety lever. We'll talk about its role, but do notice too that it is moving whenever I work the trigger as well. But let's just focus on the sear. So I press the trigger and the sear cams downward, bringing the engagement surface down. Once that engagement surface goes down, if you can imagine the lug or hook of the sear sitting here, once that engagement surface drops down far enough, then that striker pin is going to slip free and move forward as designed. Okay, so now that we understand the mechanics of normal sear operation when using the trigger, the first question is, can the sear move without using the trigger? So let's see. I'm not touching the trigger. Here's our sear. I'm going to go ahead and just start to apply some pressure. It doesn't take much pressure at all, I may add, but yeah, absolutely. The sear moves easily without not much perceived pressure at all for the sear to move independent of the trigger. Wonk, 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 wonk. Sound effects are optional, by the way. Also notice that as the sear is moving, that the safety lever, there's also a bit of movement off the safety lever. And again, I'm not touching the trigger, and we can see the safety lever move slightly along with the sear. So how is that? Well, if you recall the animation, the back area of the sear is just sitting on, or as I describe it, floating on top of two small springs. To better illustrate, here's a sear, obviously removed from the pistol, and here we have where the sear pivot pin lives at the front. Here's our engagement surface, and here at the back are the two small springs that this rear of the sear is just floating on. Remember, it only has a pivot pin up front, while the back is just floating on these two very small sear springs. At this point, let me touch on the P320's manual safety. Some models of P320, including all the military's M17 and M18 pistols, are equipped with the manual safety. Unfortunately, this manual safety only prevents the trigger from moving rearward by blocking only the trigger bar, this component here. So as I go to work the trigger to the rear, you'll see the trigger bar moves forward. The P320 and M17 and M18 pistols manual safety only prevents the movement of this trigger bar. Therefore, it does nothing to the sear itself. The sear itself will continue to be able to be moved independent of the trigger and trigger bar. This design deficiency was corrected in the later P365 model pistol, whose manual safety mechanically blocks the sear, preventing it from moving. I'm going to put a link in the description below to an excellent comparison between the P320 and P365 manual safeties. Alright, now that we've seen the sear can, in fact, move independently of the trigger being pressed, the next question is, can the sear move enough without pressing the trigger to allow the striker pin to slip off the engagement surface? Let's find out. So I've completely reassembled the P320, putting the slide assembly back on. I'll cycle the slide assembly, which as a single action only pistol fully cocks the striker pin. And then using the trigger, I'll dry fire the pistol. As the sear drops and the striker pin clears the engagement surface, you can hear the click of the striker pin moving fully forward. This is normal operation. We'll show it again. Now the striker pin is sitting in there fully energized because it's a single action only pistol. I'll go ahead and press the trigger, and you can hear the striker pin moving fully forward. Now, without touching the trigger, I'm going to attempt to move the sear downwards enough to allow the cocked striker pin to slip off the sear's engagement surface, which is holding it. And there you go. All right, so for this next iteration, what I'm going to do is replicate that we have a manual safety equipped 320 or an M17 or an M18. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to take and actually press forward on the trigger. I'm behind the trigger. I'm pushing it forward to attempt to immobilize the trigger bar as if there's a manual safety keeping the trigger bar from moving. While doing that, I'm going to once again attempt to move the sear and see if the sear will still move down enough to allow the striker pin, lug, or hook to slip off the sear's engagement surface and fire. So I'm going to grab the front of the trigger guard and I'm going to push this trigger forward, which is going to attempt to immobilize the sear. Let me try to get at this, and then I'm going to attempt to push the sear down and see what the striker does. And there you go.
Houston, we have a problem.
Yes, indeed. In my opinion, this is the problem. Understand, for there to be any chance of the P320 firing without touching the trigger, what is referred to as an uncommanded discharge, there first must be a slipping of the striker pin off of the sear, occurring without pulling the trigger. I have demonstrated this is entirely possible. However, does the fact the striker pin is capable of slipping off the floating sear without touching the trigger mean an uncommanded discharge will occur? No, not necessarily. The P320 is equipped with two other design features which potentially can stop a runaway striker pin that has slipped off the sear. They are, first, what I term the intercept notch of the sear, and second, the striker's safety lock. Before we return to the armorer's bench, let's look at these two images. All right, so looking at the virtual cutaway, we can see the sear, and then up here we can see the striker pin assembly. If we move back along the striker pin assembly, we'll see that the striker pin's lug or hook is resting here in the sear's engagement surface here at the back of the sear. We'll also see that the rear of the sear is sitting on top of two small sear springs. Moving forward of the sear's engagement surface, I've went ahead and circled what is the sear's intercept notch or secondary notch. And then moving back upward to the striker pin assembly, we'll see that the safety lock here is called out in orange. So we're back at the bench, and with the images in mind, let's first look at the sear. Here's our sear. Here's the front of the sear where the sear pin goes through. And again, the sear pivots on that pin, which I use the term as a sear pivot pin at the front. At the back of the sear, we know that it is sitting on or floating on two small sear springs. Also at the back, we'll notice the engagement surface of the sear, where in normal operation, the striker pin's lug or hook rests in that sear's engagement surface. Now, forward of this, we'll see this intercept notch or secondary notch of the sear. The concept being, if the striker pin should slip off the engagement surface, then the intercept notch will catch or intercept the striker pin's lug or hook like this, stopping forward motion and preventing a potential uncommanded discharge. The next design feature, which potentially can stop a runaway striker pin, that has slipped off the sear is the striker's safety lock. So if we look at our striker pin assembly, we'll see off to the right the safety lock. At rest, the safety lock engages with the striker pin resting in a notch at the back, the intent being to block forward movement of the striker pin. In operation, when the trigger is pressed to the rear, the trigger bar will move forward. So here's our assembly here. As I pull the trigger to the rear, we'll see the trigger bar then move forward. With the trigger bar moving forward, we'll then see the safety lever, this component part here, then move upwards. The safety lever will push the safety lock upwards, pushing it up out of the notch and out of the path of the striker pin, so that the striker pin, when it slips off that primary engagement surface of the sear, can then move fully forward and impact the primer. As an armorer, we want to check the function of the safety lock anytime we have the pistol disassembled or even field strip. So the safety lock has three functions. One, it has to stop the striker pin. Two, it has to then allow the striker pin to pass by it when it's warranted, when we want the gun to fire. And then lastly, the safety lock has to re-engage with the striker pin once we're done shooting. To test this with our field stripped gun, and here's our slide assembly, we can see the striker pin lug or hook sitting here. And then in this case, off to the left-hand side, since we got the slide upside down, we have the safety lock. The first thing I'm going to attempt to do is to push the striker pin beyond the safety lock. I'm going to try to push the striker pin fully forward, trying to defeat the safety lock. So I will do that now, and we see that the safety lock stops forward motion of the striker pin. So it passed test one. The next thing we're going to do is that I'm going to go ahead and depress the safety lock like so, and then I'm going to go ahead and push the striker pin forward. And pushing the striker pin forward, we should be able to see, let me raise this up, we should be able to see the tip of the striker pin protruding out the breech face. And we do. So this replicates that we have the trigger pressed to the rear, the trigger bar is moved forward, and that the safety lever is now pushing the safety lock out of the way, allowing the striker pin to move fully forward and pass through the breech face and impact the primer. So it passed test number 2. The last test is that we want to see that the striker pin reset spring, which lives inside the housing, or I should say the striker pin assembly here, has sufficient energy to push the striker pin back and reset. And I'll tell you, on this particular gun, you've seen I'm no longer pushing on the striker pin, but it hasn't reset, meaning I can continue to push the striker pin forward. So the striker pin reset spring in this striker pin assembly that's in this slide is suspect. The spring might be broken, or the spring might be too weak, but it should be resetting on its own, and it's not. What should happen is that as soon as I let go of the striker pin should be pushed back by that striker pin reset spring like this, to where then we can see the safety lock re-engaging. To help illustrate the operation, here's another animation. All right, so we're looking again inside our virtual cutaway of the P320, and here we can see our striker pin assembly, and then we can see the safety lock called out in orange here. If we follow the striker pin out the back of the assembly, we'll see that the striker pin's hook or lug is once again sitting inside the sear's engagement surface, and then we can see the back of the sear floating on those two small sear springs. Here is also the sear intercept notch. But when I start the animation, what I want you to focus on is this component's relationship to the safety lock. You're going to see that when the trigger is pulled to the rear and the trigger bar moves forward, you're going to see this safety lever, this piece here, is going to push the safety lock up and out of the way, out of the path of the striker pin, so that when the striker pin leaves the engagement surface down here, the striker pin can then move fully forward and impact the round and detonate the cartridge. There's that safety lever moving up, pushing the safety lock out of the way so that the striker pin can then move fully forward and impact the primer, causing the round to go off. Okay, so having now reviewed the P320's design, we need to realize for the pistol to fire without touching the trigger, to experience what has been termed an uncommanded discharge, requires cascading system failures. A failure chain reaction starting with the striker pin slipping off the sear, moving past the sear's intercept notch, and finally bypassing the striker safety lock to impact the cartridge primer. A very reasonable question is, how can all this possibly happen? Before I offer an explanation, we need to understand what parts are and what assemblies are. Parts versus assemblies. So parts are individual singular component pieces, such as the recoil spring guide and recoil spring. Assemblies, on the other hand, are complex components comprised of multiple parts, such as the recoil spring assembly. In this example below, to help illustrate, we have the recoil spring assembly consists of the recoil spring guide and recoil spring parts. Here's our complete assembly, here's our recoil spring guide, and here's the recoil spring. These two parts put together build the recoil spring assembly. So there are three general categories of issues which can potentially play a role in contributing to an uncommanded discharge in the P320. The first, dimensional issues. This can be a result of inconsistencies in part manufacture and or due to wear. Next, fitment issues between parts and or assemblies. Here we're talking about the spacing or tolerances between individual parts and or assemblies. You may have heard of the term stacking of tolerances, which can be defined as stacking of tolerances. The cumulative effect of individual dimensional tolerances on a part or assembly where the variations from each component add up when assembled, potentially leading to a significant deviation from the desired final dimension, even if each individual part falls within its specified tolerance range. So another way to think of this is to understand a pistol is the sum total of all its parts and assemblies. In addition to tolerance issues at time of manufacture, during assembly, and or developing as a result of wear, another possible challenge to maintaining acceptable tolerances in the P320 might be its modularity. For example, you may have a P320 that in its originally manufactured configuration was within acceptable safe tolerances. However, when you go and place the original fire control unit in a different grip module and or install a different slide assembly onto that particular fire control unit, you may then create a tolerance issue. That's something to consider. The last category is environmental issues. Here we're talking about external influences such as vibration, jarring shock, torsion between the slide and frame and fire control unit, and then internal conditions like foreign matter inside the pistol, debris like dirt or mud, presence of carbon fouling, brass shavings, or other byproducts of shooting, perhaps combined with certain cleaning solvents and or lubricants. Now, understand a problem in any one or multiple categories, particularly on parts or assemblies related to sear, striker, and or striker safety lock operation, can potentially contribute to an uncommanded discharge in a particular P320, M17, or M18 pistol. It's this causal complexity which can make it hard for someone like me, who's brought in after a suspected uncommanded discharge incident, to try and 1, diagnose exactly what happened, and 2, attempt to replicate it. Woo! So after this analysis, what do I think? Well, where there's smoke, there's fire. To date, as best as I can determine open source, in the civilian and law enforcement sectors, there have been over 80 reported uncommanded discharges with the P320. On the military side, with the M17 and M18 pistols, I found reports of at least 9 uncommanded discharges, 5 of which resulted in injury. And remember, the military's M17 and M18 pistols have manual safeties, which again only block the trigger and does not prevent the floating sear from moving. In assessing risks, I would recognize the P320's uncommanded discharge danger as being high risk but low frequency, in the red zone of this risk matrix graphic. Low frequency because there are many P320s, M17s, and M18s out there being used, presumably, which are working safely. However, high risk because as I have shown with the floating sear, an uncommanded discharge is absolutely possible. And when it happens, horrific, life-changing, career-ending injuries and possibly death can occur. In my opinion, mitigating the inherent risk of an uncommanded discharge in the P320, M17, or M18 pistols would require employing a manual safety design similar to that used in the P365, meaning a manual safety which mechanically blocks the sear. Now, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention SIG response to allegations of P320 uncommanded discharges. Publicly, SIG has vehemently denied any possibility of the P320 firing without actuating the trigger. Frankly, I think that is a very bold statement because any mechanical device can fail. And as I have hopefully objectively shown, the P320 is not immune, not by a long shot. While publicly SIG has staunchly defended the P320, behind closed doors there have been some lawsuit settlements, all subject to non-disclosure agreements or NDAs, so we will never be privy to the details of those settled claims. Also, at the time of this video, there have been 2 substantial judgments against SIG for $2.35 million and $11 million. SIG is appealing these. SIG's response to the potential P320 issued reminded me of another situation. In the 70s, Ford manufactured a subcompact car called the Pinto. The Pinto was known by Ford to have a design flaw in which the gas tank could rupture during a rear-end collision and fuel could ignite. Over nearly a decade of production, 27 people perished as a result of the Pinto's design deficiency, and ultimately Ford paid tens of millions of dollars in lawsuits. Now, did every Pinto involved in a rear-end collision burst into flames? No. However, did every Pinto have the design flaw which could potentially cause a gas tank to rupture during a rear-end collision and the fuel to ignite? Yes. In a similar vein, will every P320 experience an uncommanded discharge? No. However, does every P320 have, in my opinion, a design flaw which could potentially contribute to an uncommanded discharge? Yes. And these are the reasons why you will not see me driving a Ford Pinto or using a SIG P320. I'm Joey Russo, disabled competitive pistol shooter and retired Rangemaster. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care, and remember, where there's a will, there's always a way. Don't let anything keep you from pursuing your passion.